that's a great point too, right? Because if you look at the stories that you have chosen to include, like it's not all just cut and dry stats, like, oh, on this day, so and so scored his 700th goal or whatever. Like, you also delve a little bit into some pop culture and some other things that are a little bit broader than just hockey there. So when you're starting to comb through these stories, like were there some really good stories that either piqued your interest because they were just so strange or unbelievable that they had happened? Didn't end up making either of the final volumes there, but any that stood out to you as this was just an enjoyable thing that I happened to stumble across. Not sure if it's worthy of making it into a book though.
No, I think actually this time around, those things that I came across, like they made it into the book, because I think what was different from the first book was that I was kind of just working to like put together 365, and I keep saying 365, but there is that extra story for leap years. So there is 366, but obviously 366 doesn't have the same ring to it. But with the first book, I was just trying to get all those stories kind of figured out so I could start writing them. But with this, when I knew that the first book was done, in the 3 years that followed, you kind of start to think about them in a different way, and you're like, that's an interesting story. I'd never come across it before. I'd put it into an Excel sheet and kind of start filing away these ideas for when we got to the second book. And then even, there's stories when you're doing research, you uncover a different angle or a different story that you weren't even looking for. And so there was actually one example where I forget what story I was researching, but I came across another story in the newspaper at the time, and it was about when Harry Neal was coaching in the WHA, and he got into an altercation when his team, he was coaching the Whalers at the time, and they were playing against the Birmingham Bulls. And I guess towards the end of the game, the Whalers were about to win the game, and the fans were getting pretty rowdy. And he took a stick and he kind of swung it towards the fans' direction. He ended up like hitting three of these fans, including one happened to be an old lady. And he left that night. Like the police were trying to get after him in the dressing room. And, he talked to his lawyer, and his lawyer said, you need to get out of town. And they're obviously in Alabama at the time. So under the cover of darkness, he went to Atlanta, and then he went home because he was worried that they're going to issue an arrest warrant for him. And eventually they did. The woman that came forward, brought charges against Harry Neal. When they went back to Alabama later that season, he went before the court and the charges were thrown out. But that was an example where I hadn't planned on including that story. I think we all know, or some of us are familiar with the Harry Neal story, against in the Nordiques game at the Colisée, where they climbed into the stands and he got suspended for 10 games. So I thought this is too perfect that obviously that happens, this moment in the WHA happens, 10 years or so before the Vancouver moment. And so you kind of have to put those together, but that's another happy accident where I wasn't looking for that Harry Neal story. And of course I had to include it because, anytime a coach gets involved with the fans, it's going to be an interesting yarn for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's the one end of the spectrum, right? Is the happy accident you stumble upon something. That's sort of the opposite end, though, would be there's some legends and folk tales and stuff that goes from dressing room to dressing room, and oh, this was the hilarious story or this time, and they sort of get exaggerated. So were there any stories that you had come across that once you started doing some research or maybe even talked to the people that were involved, you found out that the version that you had heard that piqued your interest wasn't anywhere near as interesting as what ultimately ended up happening?
Yeah, no, there's actually a pretty, I think, well-known version of that and that's the night when, Maurice Richard goes out and he scores 5 goals and he adds, 3 assists. That's an NHL record for most, goals and points in a night. But the folklore behind that story is that he moved into a new, apartment that same day in Montreal, moved his family across town, hauled all the furniture in, and then he went out that night and played that game. Right. And it's been, I think, part of hockey history lore. There's even a Heritage Minute about it, where they've got, like a reenactment of him hauling his sofa up the stairs and then going out and obviously having an incredible game. And I think we've all kind of taken that moment as that's just what happened. Right. And then as I was doing research for that story, because, I'm familiar with that story, familiar with the Heritage Minutes, I found a Dave Stubbs article. Dave Stubbs works for the NHL. He does a lot of great hockey history for the league. And he did some work during the pandemic, and he found an interview that Maurice Richard had given with a French language newspaper many years after that. And he said that didn't happen the same day, that actually he had done the move the day before. So the day of the game, he wasn't actually moving his furniture across town the way that we all think. And so I don't think it takes anything away from what he did on the ice that night, because I think 5 goals and 8 points is still pretty incredible. And I think it makes just all of us feel a little bit more human that you know, after a night of moving into a new house or an apartment, if all you did was sit on the couch and have a beer, that's okay, because not everybody goes out and scores 5 goals. And so that was one where I think obviously you could have gone with, you know, the mythologized version of that and just talked about what he did. But I think, you know, as a historian, it's always, I think you have a duty to try to obviously put together the most accurate and factual version of events as you can. And so when I did include that story, I did talk about the work that Dave had done, you know, to kind of set the record straight. And so that's part of that story where, again, I don't think it takes any shine off what Richard had done, but it certainly, I think, puts it in a different light.
Yeah, it's not as sexy of a, you know, heritage moment, 30-second commercial there of, and then at the end of the day, he
Yeah.
had a good night's sleep, and then he went into the rink the next day.
Yeah.
So.